progress.
I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, the U.S. is making its presence felt in yet another international war, as President Biden attempts to aid and influence Israel. But what should America's role be as more civilians die in Gaza? Then, an alarming rise in anti-Semitic harassment and violence on college campuses since the Israel-Hamas war began. What kind of role should the United States play in the war between Israel and Hamas? Right now, many of the hundreds of American citizens stuck in Gaza are on their way back home after finally being allowed to cross the border into Egypt. The Palestinians that remain are now facing ground attacks from Israeli soldiers in addition to airstrikes, which have brought the death toll up to more than 9,000 people in Gaza. The situation there has prompted a top United Nations official to step down from his post, saying Israel is committing a, quote, textbook case of genocide while the international community turns a blind eye. Still, President Joe Biden is calling on Congress to pass billions in aid to Israel and urging Prime Minister Netanyahu to protect civilians in Gaza, while maintaining Israel's right to defend itself. He outlined his view of America's role in this war and others like it in a recent Oval Office address.
American leadership is what holds the world together. American alliances are what keep us, America, safe. American values are what make us a partner that other nations want to work with.
Biden is the latest in a long line of American leaders who have seen this country as a moral authority for global conflicts, a controversial notion that has drawn a lot of pushback around the world and here at home, including from historian Andrew Bacevich. In a recent Boston Globe op-ed, he questioned Biden's view, asking, is the U.S. an indispensable nation or reckless and misguided? He's also the co-founder and board chair for the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a professor emeritus of history at BU. He joins me now. Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So, can you lay out what you think the United States' mistake is in its policy in Israel and maybe in Ukraine as well?
Well, I think the broader mistake, the error of judgment, was actually contained in that clip that you just played of the president. The assertion that we are called upon to be the global leader, and that endows upon the United States some kind of great moral authority. I think that when you examine our behavior, particularly since the end of the Cold War, particularly since 9/11, our own actions undermine the president's claims. And so the beginning of wisdom, to my mind, is to give up those claims and move to a more modest and realistic posture. Now, what would that mean with regard to Ukraine? What would that mean with regard to Gaza, Israel? It seems to me that acknowledging the difficulty and the complexities of those two conflicts, that we should exert ourselves to try to bring each of them to a close rather than adding fuel to extend them.
So, but just to push on this, let's start with Ukraine, perhaps. The U.S. could push to and bring the conflict to a close by cutting off Ukraine from American support. I mean, that would end in defeat for Ukraine, presumably, and a close. But that doesn't sound to me like what you're advocating.
No, I think that, and I'll be speaking in general terms here rather than specifics. But the origins of the Ukraine war, an unnecessary war, in my view. The origins of the war came from an unwillingness on the part of the United States and some of its allies to acknowledge that Russia does have a vital interests, has security interests. And those security interests require Russia to have some sense of not being surrounded by adversaries. NATO expansion was a disastrous undertaking by the United States, and the insistence of the United States that Ukraine should join NATO was the proximate cause of this war.
Andrew,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm just going to push you on that a little bit, because my recollection of history is that the United States did not insist that Ukraine join NATO. It insisted at most that Ukraine should in future have the option of joining NATO. I don't think that's the same thing.
Well, it may not be the same thing, but it certainly rhymes. And I think given the aggressiveness with which the U.S. sponsored the eastward march of NATO to include, for example, incorporating the Baltic republics, former Soviet republics, incorporating them into NATO, it would be reasonable, I think, for Russian leaders to conclude that Ukraine is next on the hit list. And they have made very clear over a period of years that they consider that to be a basis for going to war. I'm not justifying anything Putin has done. He's a criminal. He is certainly not a friend to freedom and democracy, but it's pretty understandable if you look at it from Russia's point of view, how they have behaved. And I think the general point here is that we have not looked at the situation from the other guy's point of view. One might even say the same thing with regard to Gaza, Israel, that very few people in official Washington stepped back and said, well, I wonder how the residents of Gaza might react if the conditions locking them Gazans up in this small piece of territory, if those conditions persist. We didn't ask the question. Apparently, the Israelis didn't ask the question. And so we've all been shocked and surprised.
So I think this question of, understanding the world from the other side's point of view seems like a critical hinge here. But it seems like there's a third party, to stick to Russia and the Russia and Ukraine for a second, which is the Ukrainians' point of view. Because surely their vote, and they seem to really, really not want to be part of the Russian sphere of influence, also has something to say here, right?
Absolutely. And, and if I were a Ukrainian, if that's where my loyalty lay, I might sign up to that proposition. But I'm an American, and my primary interest is the security and well-being of the United States. I think that ought to be the primary consideration of President Biden. And it seems to me that, and not just Biden, but his predecessor as well, that the course of action that we have followed has tended to lose sight of our own interests, of our own security, of our own well-being. We end up being involved in more wars than we need, many of which have done great harm to the United States.
So to shift the lens, so there's a huge gap in policy between the invasion of Iraq and funneling weapons to Ukraine or to Israel. So in the case of the Israel, right, what would the more restrained policy that you're advocating look like?
Well, there's no question that it doesn't matter what I say on this point. The United States is going to continue to provide the wherewithal to Israel to help it in the conduct of its war. That's I think, a given. And we'll see how the Congress acts on that, but I think it's going to continue to happen. There's pretty good evidence that after the president's we will be with you forever rhetoric that immediately followed the Gaza terrorist attack, I think there's pretty good evidence that there's some rethinking going on in Washington. And that the notion of trying to exert some amount of restraint on Israel's conduct of the war, that idea is gaining favor. I think it's a good idea. Partly from a humanitarian point of view, partly because however difficult it may be, we absolutely need to find some path to bring this war to an end for our own security interests, for strategic reasons. And therefore, toning down the level of violence is, I think, a first preliminary step in that direction. That needs to happen.
So I want to keep pushing on that. What does toning down the level of violence look like in the wake of the Hamas attacks, right? If the Israeli government sees the largest death of Jews in any day since the Holocaust, I think it would be difficult for the U.S. government to say, well, you should not respond to that. You should allow them.
And nobody has suggested that. I mean, they have responded vigorously, to put it mildly.
So I guess what I'm asking is there a line where you'd say this is too much? Or where we should back, like what specifically should the U.S. government be telling the Israelis to do or not do?
I think some of that telling is going on right now. Mm-hmm. That as far as we can tell, as distant observers, watching TV, the conditions inside Gaza, which were never good, are now horrific. and therefore something needs to be done to try to rein in the level of violence. I personally think we have very limited leverage with Israel. On any matter that touches on Israeli national security, they insist upon exercising an enormous level of autonomy. Nonetheless, we need to do our best to try to curb the level of violence as a preliminary step towards finding a way to ending the conflict.
And then in both of these, Andrew, you sort of mentioned that you didn't like the sort of casting of the United States itself as the indispensable nation, going back to Madeleine Albright. So I just want to ask as the final question of that is, if the United States viewed itself differently, if the United States, say, wasn't leaning in to help protect Ukraine right now, I imagine the outcome of the war would look a lot different. Doesn't that kind of meet the dictionary definition of indispensable?
Well, perhaps we're going to disagree on this point. I think the record shows that inflated claims about our influence and about our capacity to direct events in the world leads to disaster. Where is the proof? Well, the proof is in the behavior of the United States, an example, the behavior of the United States after 9/11. When we launched the folly of the global war on terrorism, which has cost our country dearly in blood, in treasure, and perhaps at least as important in creating instability in our own democracy. We can't afford any more of that. And therefore, we need to think about what a more prudent and realistic way of dealing in the world might be.
Professor Andrew Bacevich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot.
Harvard University is launching an anti-Semitism advisory board amid building tensions over the Israel-Hamas war, seen in this video posted to social media. And it's not just Harvard. Classes at Cornell University were canceled for a day over anti-Semitic threats and extraordinary stress over the war. At Tulane University, 2 Jewish students were reportedly assaulted by pro-Palestinian protesters. And in New York City, the governor announced an independent review of anti-Semitism policies at public colleges in the city. In just the first 2 weeks after the Hamas attack on Israel, the Anti-Defamation League recorded 312 anti-Semitic incidents. That's nearly 4 times higher than the same time last year. So what can colleges do to ramp down tensions, protect students, and protect academic freedom? I'm joined now by Cornell Brooks, former president of the NAACP, who now teaches public leadership and social justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, and by Jeremy Burton, executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council. Jeremy, Cornell, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jeremy, what are you seeing on campuses across the country?
Well, as you indicated in your intro, there are some truly horrific and scary incidents going on many campuses around the country. Candidly, while some of the most prominent Ivy League and most prominent schools in the country have gotten the attention, this is happening everywhere. And even here in Boston, the attention has been given to Harvard University, but I'm hearing about incidents at Wellesley, at Simmons, at Emerson, at BU, et cetera, that are just very scary.
So, Cornell, you've spent your life fighting racism and bigotry of all kinds. It must be shocking to see a resurgence of the oldest form of bigotry coming, I won't say out of nowhere, but in a way that we would not have expected even a few years ago.
It is morally shocking, but historically unsurprising. Because just as you named, anti-Semitism as the oldest hate predates this war and will likely continue after this war. And what we see on American college campuses is emblematic of what has happened and is happening all across this country. And if the statistics are true, and we have every reason to believe that they are, is happening around the world. So this is a serious moment. It's not historically shocking, but it should make us vigilant and decisive in terms of how we respond to it.
So, Jeremy, do you have an explanation for what we're seeing here?
Well, I think that in times of trauma, in times of division, there is a propensity to go to classic hatreds and frankly classic explanations of who is my oppressor, who is behind whatever harm I am experiencing. And I think we've seen that in this country in recent years, that for a variety of reasons, people from the left, from the right, in seeking someone to blame for their troubles, go back to that default of it must be the Jews. There are other forms of hatred and bigotry that are on the rise, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and they each have a particular character to them. But anti-Semitism is deeply rooted in the idea that fundamentally the Jew is to blame for whatever is going wrong in my society. And it is no surprise at a time like this, when people are angry and feeling pain, they're turning to the Jew to blame.
So historically, anti-Semitism is, obviously a part of American society, a part of European society all around the world, but I think it's been more associated with the right than the left. And so I think a lot of the shock that we're seeing here is in places that sort of very self-consciously identify themselves as being safe and welcoming of minorities and having large institutional establishments for diversity and seeing incidents that are, right, clearly not protesting policies, but have clearly crossed some sort of a line into, like, open anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. So I think that there is a false sense of security derived from ideology or party, which is to say that anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, xenophobia is associated with the right. And in terms of violence, it most certainly is, but it is not the monopoly of the right. And so we need not be vigilant with respect to one side of the ideological spectrum and to ignore the prospect of hate and violence and hate crimes on the other side. It's a matter of attacking hate for what it is as such. And so when we see this spike in anti-Semitism, 400% most recently, much more than that over the last 6 or so years, it should be alarming for us because it literally represents a threat to our democracy and a threat to our democracy in the place where we are most vulnerable, namely among our young people, and in the places where we should expect at least, that is to say, on college campuses where we nurture the intellect, we build character, we literally prepare those who are going to be the custodians of our democracy. So the point being here is we can't derive any false sense of security because the anti-Semite, the racist, has a D or an R or conservative or liberal attached to their ideology and their hate.
I agree with what Cornell said, and I would add that it actually isn't surprising to see this kind of anti-Semitism appearing on the far left. I think one of the dangers we have as a society is saying that anti-Semitism fits neatly onto an ideological wing of the political spectrum, and that in some part, we've had a very toxic dynamic where people weaponize anti-Semitism to go after their political opponents, so we don't get attention to anti-Semitism as it shows up in a variety of ways. We've certainly seen anti-Semitism on the left rising. I think right here in Boston, we saw that last year around the mapping project and the desire by some to say that the local Jewish community in Boston ought to be dismantled for its role in everything from American colonialism to the existence of, every problem under the sun. What is more troubling right now in the last 4 weeks is that it's essentially coming out of the closet, that people are marching in the streets declaring explicit support for a terrorist organization, celebrating terrorism. And I think what's also challenging is that good people in liberal society are finding it difficult to find the words to denounce it and to stand up to it.
Jeremy, I just have to say, thank you for naming this as such. What I mean by that is rape, murder, torture, beheadings are, at their essence, violence. And where you target Jewish people for such, this is emblematic of anti-Semitism. It is what it is. And we can't apologize for it. We can't create predicate conditions for calling out anti-Semitism. We have to call it for what it is, wherever it appears, and whoever is the perpetrator. It is what it is. Because if we don't do such, we literally morally enfeeble ourselves. We literally disempower ourselves as human beings and as moral beings. And I would note here and argue here, we also make ourselves less able to call out other isms. Note this, there are only two organizations in this country that were created to address hate crimes and in response to lynchings, the NAACP and the Anti-Defamation League. Both such organizations have condemned other forms of hate. So unless we call out this root hate, we're going to be less able to call out Islamophobia, less able to call out anti-Black racism, less able to call out anti-Asian racism or Islamophobia or any of the other isms that plague our democracy. So we have to start at the root.
Yeah.
So this isn't just a Boston phenomenon. What we see is across the country, there's a map from the ADL showing anti-Semitic incidents and anti-Israel rallies that occurred just in October. And we want to differentiate here. You can oppose the policies of the Israeli government without going over anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
But somehow the groups and rallies that are sort of most enthusiastic about saying we should not blame all Palestinians for the actions of Hamas, which clearly we should not, sometimes seem to have difficulty distinguishing between the actions of Israel and all Jews. And I wonder if it's worth commenting on that.
I'm glad you pointed that out, and I would connect that to what Cornell was just saying as well, that I think it's incumbent on all of us to recognize that we have to speak out against all the isms, the hatreds right now. FBI Director Wray just yesterday spoke to the skyrocketing anti-Semitism and anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia in this country. I feel it's incumbent on me as a Jewish leader to call out those members of Congress who frankly went on the floor yesterday and said that all Palestinians are Hamas and all Palestinians are Nazis. That has to be called out. We also need other leaders to be calling out the anti-Semitism. There's no question one can be deeply critical of the government of a country without being anti-Semitic, just as one can be deeply critical of the American government without being anti-American. And the challenge is that people are, all across the country, making this leap into the dehumanization of Jews. And I'll just give one example that we're seeing all across the country and frankly across the world. People who are proudly going on camera, almost like it's a Tide Pod challenge, and tearing down the signs of these 220 odd people, including babies, who are being held hostage. And somehow there is this need in this moment, not just to say we're critical of the Israeli response in Gaza or we are critical of the occupation, but that we need to dehumanize the Jew in this moment in order to move forward with our neat ideological package.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, that's really frightening. Why? So to the extent that we have people ripping down pictures of kidnapped victims, including children, rendering Jewish people and a moment of trauma and bigotry and violence invisible. This is on a moral plane with other ways in which we make other people invisible. So in other words, you can't like literally obliterate someone's humanity, obliterate their moral visibility, and call it anything other than what it is, which is a form of hate. I think it's important to look at the victims of kidnapping. I think it's important for us to look at the victims of bombings in Palestine in terms of kids and refugee camps. We can't wrap people in a veil of invisibility because in doing so, we make our own humanity less visible. So that is just unconscionable. We don't need to be ripping down posters. We need to be lifting people up and we need to be educating people. Because note in this moment, the shocking ignorance with respect to the Holocaust, the fact that if you ask many people and even a few students, what is a pogrom? Sometimes you get a blank stare, as in not knowing, being ignorant, and historically and morally oblivious. It's a real need for education.
Yeah.
So you also mentioned the use of anti-Semitism as a political weapon,
Mm-hmm.
and I think we're seeing that as well, where President Trump, who dined with a neo-Nazi, and sort of members of Congress who talk about Jewish space lasers starting forest fires, seem to be now standing out and accusing the other side of fostering anti-Semitism. How do we guard against this being used as a political football instead of being used as something that we actually need to all be aligned in fighting against?
I would say it very simply. If you only are calling out anti-Semitism when it serves your partisan interest to do that, you're not being a friend to the Jewish community. And if you're only calling out anti-Semitism when it's on the other side of the political aisle, you're not actually serious about it fighting anti-Semitism. You're interested in making political points. I would love to see the Republican caucus in Congress or the Republican Party deal with the anti-Semitism within its ideological partners and within its own caucus. And I would love to see the Democratic Party, and I'm not going to get into naming names, to deal with anti-Semitism as it shows up in its coalitions and spaces. The two parties can take care of themselves. They need to stop worrying about the other one.
Yeah, you know, may I note this? When Nazis were marching through the streets of Charlottesville, Virginia, there were some of these people then when they were saying the Jews will not replace us, they mean Black folks will not replace us, with their tiki torches and their penchant for violence. Where were some of these folks then? And so, in other words, this partisanization, this political hijacking of the moral condemnation of anti-Semitism is duplicitous, disingenuous, and it too should be called out. And may I just make one other point, which Jeremy lifted up, which is to say, you know, the Jewish community is not a monolith in the same way the Black community is not a monolith. And so when I hear Jewish students very thoughtfully, and engaging in a kind of political and moral analysis of Israel's policies with respect to the Palestinians, in the same way we see it among Muslim students and Palestinian students. So the point being is we need to give credit to young people for not being a monolith, for Jewish people, obviously, for not being a monolith, and stop this scapegoating by stereotyping and these overgeneralizations that literally play into these old, tired, vicious, and potentially violent tropes.
Cornell William Brooks, Jeremy Burton, thank you so much for being with us today. That's it for tonight, but come back tomorrow for Talking Politics. After a judge has okayed Governor Healey's decision to stop guaranteeing shelter to families, Adam Riley and his panel will discuss what happens next. Plus, a preview of Boston's upcoming at-large city council elections. That and more tomorrow at 7. Thanks for watching. I'm Gautam Mukunda, and good night.